Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the second of the 4 public finance debates that is being organised by the Government Economics Network and Victoria University. Those of you who were here at the last debate may remember that I said these debates were going to be chaired by myself and Giro Karochalu as the head of the Government Economics Network, so you might be surprised to see me standing here and not him. That's purely because he's had to be out of town, unfortunately, for this debate. But I'm determined to rope him in for chairing at least one of the future debates of the remaining 2. Can I just 2 or 3 words about housekeeping type issues. You may or may not have noticed there are video cameras running. That's just to keep a record for future possibly teaching or publicity purposes or whatever. So if you don't want to be caught on camera, keep looking at me and don't look at the back of the room. But the back of your head's going to get it anyway. Second point is that if in an emergency we had to evacuate, door here, but there's also a door back left as you look, far left corner, which takes you straight out of the building. And third housekeeping item, can you turn your mobiles to silent or off or something, just in case they choose to interrupt us in the middle. So you can see well, actually, you can't see on screen at the moment because we're tracking through some information about all the debates. But today's debate is on the subject of New Zealand should tax all its capital income at 20% or less. You probably can realise we've tagged a number to all of these debates. So the use of the 20% is 20. Sorry, what did I say? 20. Oh. 0% or less. So the use of the number here is largely to help to get minds to focus on some specifics, but the key point of this debate is around whether we should be taxing in New Zealand income at a given rate, regardless of whether it is earned from labour earnings or from capital. So just to give you a little bit of background, many of you will realise or be well aware that during the 1980s, New Zealand went to a system of setting the tax rate at 33% for corporate income, for trust income, and for personal income, at least the top rate of personal income. So labour and capital income was in some sense taxed similarly, although of course, as many people keep reminding me, capital gains aren't taxed at all. But from around the 2000s, things began to change quite a bit. The top rate of income tax raised to 39%, of course, but then the corporate rate dropped to 33%, and then last year it dropped to 28%. In addition, there have been a bunch of other changes, some of which have meant that if you invest in certain types of ways in New Zealand, you'll be taxed at 28%, the famous PIEs, portfolio investment vehicles being one of them. But if you invest in capital in other ways, you'll be taxed at 33% if you're a top rate taxpayer. Or whatever other personal rate if you're a lower tax rate payer. So New Zealand's system is kind of a mixture between taxing capital and labour income the same and taxing capital and labour differently. We just do it not very differently at the moment. You compare that to the Nordic countries, and that's why we've given the little subtitle here, Should New Zealand Go Nordic? A number of Nordic countries took an explicit decision to tax capital income at around half the rate, half the top rate of personal income tax. And they did that for a variety of reasons that you don't want to hear from me now. But it raises the question for New Zealand, is there any future in New Zealand's tax system being more like the Nordic system, perhaps, of taxing capital at 28% or even 20% or even less, but not doing that for labour income? So that's why we've set up this particular topic for the debate today. Let me introduce you to the 3 people who are going to talk to us to propose the motion that the tax rate should be set at 28% or less. Is Michael Reddell. Many of you will know Michael, of course, already. Michael's been a long-time expert on macroeconomics at the Reserve Bank, spent 2 years in Treasury, coincidentally, while I was there, so he and I managed to agree on a lot and disagree on a lot, or disagree on a little, perhaps, and agree on a lot. But in either case, it was always an enjoyable challenge debating with Michael. Robin Oliver, of course, anybody who knows tax and doesn't know Robin, then they don't know tax in New Zealand, because Robin probably knows tax policy better than anybody in New Zealand. He was Deputy Commissioner for Tax Policy, Head of Policy Advice Division for many years, and I'm sure nobody better could oppose the motion and support a system of not reducing capital tax rates relative to income tax rates than Robin. And talking about people who are better qualified than one could possibly hope to imagine, John Creddy, I think I'm probably right in saying that John is the most published economist in New Zealand or Australia, full stop. If that's not true, and I'm pretty certain it is true, he is absolutely certainly the most published economist in tax and public economics across Australia and New Zealand, full stop. So John is going to provide some commentary, namely, hopefully, guide us in our question time over whether we should believe the kind of things that Michael's going to tell us or believe the kind of things that Robin is going to tell us. So without further delay, let me invite Michael to start us off by proposing the motion. That doesn't look quite right. That looks more like it. That we should tax capital income at 20%, 28% or less.
Considerably less. After the last debate, I think Norman was commenting that he had visions of the Oxford Union debates, so if you want to heckle, that's fine. I pointed out to him that if he hires grey bureaucrats to debate, he doesn't get David Longy. But my proposition today is a simple one, that income earned on capital, whether that's profit, rent, interest, dividends, should be taxed at a substantially lower rate than labour income, substantially lower than 28% in fact. It's not an ideological claim, it's not a partisan claim, and at a conceptual level it shouldn't really be particularly controversial. After all, it's decades of ever since the comprehensive approach dominated the textbooks. It's 35 years since Atkinson and Stiglitz showed that under certain restrictive conditions, capital income should be optimally taxed at a zero rate. In a recent paper just out of a month or two ago, Piketty and Sayce, no right-wing extremists them, note simply that according to the profession's most popular theoretical models, tax rates on capital should be equal to zero in the long run, including from the viewpoint of those individuals and dynasties who own no capital at all. Of course, they go on to refine and limit that proposition, but they still conclude that capital income should be taxed more lightly than labour income. Just this week, the Democrat supporting economics blogger on Slate, Matthew Iglesias, made exactly that case under the provocative headline, Why Mitt Romney's effective tax rate is so low and why it probably should be. So this isn't a matter of partisan ideology. Taxing capital income, and especially the capital income of foreigners, isn't the way to lift New Zealand's living standards. I don't have many slides today, but this is the starkest of them. Shows just how far labour productivity, that's real GDP per hour worked, has slipped in New Zealand relative to the average for a group of advanced countries that I could find the data for easily. The fall's only slowed and not stopped in the last 20 years, and we need to turn it around. But why focus on tax on capital income? Well, lots of things make for growth. Labour inputs, of course, are one of them. But by OECD standards, we in New Zealand have high labour force participation rates, high hours worked per capita. And if one uses tertiary qualifications as a proxy for human capital, we also score highly. So highly that on OECD estimates, the returns to tertiary education in New Zealand are now among the lowest in the OECD. So to a first approximation, New Zealand doesn't really have a labour issue. In other contexts, I'll argue that we probably have too much of it. General micro-regulatory policies also play a part. New Zealand's looked pretty good, really. Early last year, a group of OECD researchers published a cross-country study looking at the income effects of a range of micro-policies, product market regulation and so on. New Zealand and Australia and the US scored best on the policies. Our policy should have been consistent with incomes here above those of the OECD average. Our incomes should have been 20% above average on that model. In fact, of course, we're 20% below. Size and distance might matter too, but if, say, New Zealand was doomed to relative decline, I think we might have expected to see a couple of decades of current account surpluses. Lots of savings, not much to invest it in here, rather than continued deficits. And very low interest rates rather than surprisingly high ones. But those are issues for other debates. So we've got lots of good quality labour, some reasonably good policy backdrops in most areas, but where we lag is investment and the associated sense of the entrepreneurial opportunities here. When people do growth accounting exercises for New Zealand, they typically find that the amount of capital per worker is quite low and that total factor productivity, or TFP, also falls short. In a well-governed market economy with proper market disciplines for failure, without too many subsidies or distortions, the two are probably connected. Successful firms driving the economy forward are likely to be investing more, and physical investment is one of the key ways in which firms are able to reach the TFP frontier. So this isn't some sort of crude lump of capital model in which investment is good and so more investment's always better. We tried that, we did think big. The Chinese are trying it now. But we also know that successful, fast-growing firms in a high-performing economy are likely to be undertaking more investment than firms in underperforming economies. Investment as a share of GDP in New Zealand is pretty much around OECD averages. But remember that New Zealand's GDP is low. We're a poor OECD country. And this is a chart that was taken out of a recent OECD survey on New Zealand. I'm not sure whether you can see the lines. Yes, you can reasonably well there. The bottom line, the blue line, is New Zealand's investment per worker relative to the OECD average. And you can see it's not much more than 60% of that. This excludes housing, but housing doesn't actually change the picture very much. An economy on a path to closing the income and productivity gaps would be likely to see much more investment than that, especially one like New Zealand with relatively rapid population growth. But of course, this is a debate about tax, and my time's short, so let's come back to tax. Simply put, my argument is that New Zealand should be taxing capital income much more lightly. We need more entrepreneurial activity and investment as part of a process that will finally see us realising our potential. We probably need more savings too. The investment needs to be financed, and most of us will probably get a bit queasy at the prospect of New Zealand running an even larger negative net international investment position for too long. At present, of course, we lean in the opposite direction. The data on the stuff are less than ideal, but such as they are, it appears that we've relied more heavily on taxation on capital income, despite not having an unduly large amount of capital, than many other OECD countries. Until recently, as Norman pointed out, we taxed all factor incomes at the taxpayer's labour income tax rate. Very few other countries do that. And New Zealand's the only OECD country not to have any material social security taxes, taxes that hit labour income and are often quite substantial, but not capital income. I suspect too that the move in 89 from an EET to a TTE system for the taxation of life insurance and retirement savings, as much for short-term revenue gains as anything, so some tell me, is probably more significant than we realise. Our EET system is unique in the OECD. We tax income derived from these forms of savings more heavily relative to other forms of income than almost any other OECD country does. Then there's the interaction between inflation and the tax system. That means that we tax fixed income returns particularly heavily. Even our 28% company tax rate is not that low by international standards. When I checked this morning, there were only 9 OECD countries, I think, with a higher headline rate. And our broad base and limited number of exemptions, the absence of excessive depreciation provisions, etc., means that the effective rate relative to the statutory rate is higher than it looks relative to other countries. And curiously, the tax reforms of 2010 actually raised the overall tax rate on capital income. Since some people here are looking for digs about capital gains tax, on the other hand, we don't have a capital gains tax, and on that count, we should give thanks for small mercies. So, why not try the Nordic or dual income tax model instead? From my reading, what the Nordic countries who've adopted this system were wanting to do was 3 things. They wanted to keep a progressive tax system for labour income, and they wanted to keep a large state, quite high government total spending as a share of GDP. But they also wanted to ensure that their economies continued to grow strongly, recognising that capital is mobile and that business investment and entrepreneurship are quite sensitive to expected after-tax returns.